أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So let's get started. So as usual, how are you guys doing? How have you been reframing your opportunities, your struggles into opportunities for growth? And how have you been optimizing your goals and visions to align with reality? So today, we're going to continue, and we had a case study that you guys were going to focus on. You guys are going to discuss a little bit, and then we'll go to the next thing, inshallah. So with that, the focus again has been the end vision, and we also I didn't put the slide before this that I've been putting, but that one was just pretty much making sure that your whatever it is that your vision is, it aligns with reality, right? That was step 0, and then step 1 was actually having an end vision and be very clear in it, be very detailed in it, and make sure it has some meaningful, something meaningful attached to it. So, for example, if you want to spend time with your family, right? There is some meaning attached to it, something that you enjoy attached to it, right? When you go to work, for example, but you know that you're doing it for your family, then that's the meaningful thing that's attached to it, right? These are things that I mean. That's what I mean by meaningful. And there's an extrinsic and intrinsic motivator, right? In this case, extrinsic could be just you're motivated just by whatever is going to be given to you outside, right? It's not something that you enjoy doing, but you're only doing it because you're going to get something outside, right? Meaning like you might get money and things like that. You might get enjoyment like that, but that's not the reason why you're doing this. You're doing this mainly because you want this money that you want or whatever, right? So that it drives you from the outside. And sometimes you can have peer pressure could be an extrinsic motivator towards good or bad behavior, because there could be positive peer pressure and could be negative peer pressure as well. Intrinsic is because you just want to do something because of the the experience itself, the enjoyment itself, the just doing something makes you feel good. For example, if you want to give sadaqah, for example, right? That's something that you might have, something that you might feel like I like helping out people, looking out for people and stuff. So you might give it like that. You might be like a humanitarian, for example. So that would be something that you enjoy doing, and so that would be more intrinsic. Okay, so we're gonna continue. When things go wrong, we already discussed when things are going well. We gave some examples throughout history, but we've also been now covering when things go wrong, when people don't first, for example, align their visions with reality, or they might not even have an end vision, right? Or their end vision may be something bad or whatever, so it doesn't conform with how things are supposed to be, for example, right? So that's what we've been discussing, and today, inshallah, we're going to conclude that. If you have anything else to add in terms of other examples that you might know of, then we can continue. We can focus on this next time, or we can focus on this if we have time today, inshallah. So with that, we've already covered the stuff that I've grayed out. What we haven't covered is the third world countries, and the reason why I put it in quotation marks. The reason I put it in quotation marks is because the origin of this comes from back in the Cold War, when things were, when there was one group of people, one group of countries, right, that were considered first world countries, and then there was another group of countries that were labeled as second world countries, and then there were those that didn't align with either of those sides, right, and those became the third world countries. Now later on, obviously this definition, or this usage, right, was replaced with the word developing countries. So you go from third world countries to developing countries, right? Nonetheless, you'll notice that a lot of these countries are going to be those countries that are developing, these third world countries, right? And so if you continue looking into it, you're going to find that these developing countries have been exploited through war, through oppression, through whatever, right? Through like involvement in politics from external countries and so on. And there were, there's a lot of details on why they were exploited, why their resources, for example, the natural resources they might have, were being taken by people. There's a lot of content out there, and this is content that is like authenticated in the sense that it's not made up, right? That has details and facts and stuff that's attached to it. It's not always mentioned, but you'll find professors have been writing about these things. So among those things, for example, is the intervention of the more advanced countries in the affairs of the developing countries, whether it's through coercion in terms of, like getting involved through force, or it might be, for example, in the sense of putting certain people into positions of power, for example, or it could be in terms of sort of trying to trade, not trade, but like sort of trying to put countries in a certain situation where they have to resort to giving back their natural resources as payment for some debt or some loans that have been given out to those countries. And one of the things, for example, you might find is that third world country, or sorry, that developing countries, they might be getting aid. The U.S., for example, gives a certain percentage of its total amount of its total budget is allocated towards foreign aid. I think it was 1% of its total budget, which obviously is a big amount, but nonetheless, relative to the entire budget, it's something. It's 1%, I believe, right? Yeah, and you can see the numbers in these documents that I've shared over here. Now, in this case, a country might give aid to a developing country, but if it's a corrupt government, then the government, the leaders might take the money, they might pocket it, and the corruption that happens all over the world, right? And so that the people might not end up getting that amount of money in terms of building infrastructure and so on. Now, the US and the UN have some metrics that they have put in place in terms of assessing whether their aid is being actually utilized for developing infrastructure, and infrastructure is one of the priorities that the UN, for example, has established that the countries need to work towards. So, nonetheless, let's say that it's not happening, and in that case, it's being pocketed by the people that are corrupt politicians, for example, whoever it might be, and then in return, when the money is due, for example, it might be given back in terms of certain like rights to certain natural resources, for example, or some other things that might end up exploiting the people, right? Exploiting the country's resources and so on. So this is one way that exploitation can occur. And also, as you know, the idea that in those countries, the labor is very cheap, and the resources are very cheap compared to in America, right? So what happens is that a lot of big companies, they'll outsource their products, or even like small startups and companies and stuff, they'll outsource. If you want to import from China, for example, you might be able to get a lot of things a lot cheaper than if you were to have them manufactured in America, right? So the labor is cheaper over there, so they start exporting or not exporting, but going outside to get their raw material, or they might go outside to other countries to have their labor done. For example, if you notice a lot of your shirts, for example, if you have a polo shirt, or if you have those any shirt pretty much, right? You'll see if you look at where this is made, they're gonna say made in Vietnam, for example, or made in Burma, for example, or made in like India or Pakistan, for example, or made in Bangladesh, for example, right? Those countries where it's a lot easier for people to save money, essentially, right? Because labor is cheaper over there. Now, to compensate, to sort of counter this, there are some people that have started this movement. There's this, I guess, a global movement towards fair trade. So if you notice some of the chocolate that you guys can buy, especially the more expensive one, you'll see like little symbols that would talk about fair trade, non-GMO, and things like that, right? And the idea is pretty much that these farmers of this cocoa, for example, or whatever the raw ingredient is, they're getting their due in terms of like their fair share of like the profits, or like the whatever the labor cost it would be if they were in America, for example, or in a different country, for example, right? So it's compensating for that. So it's not where people can continue to exploit them. But this is, as you know, that this is what happens. So the globalization phenomenon, where, for example, tech companies would outsource their tech support to India, for example, or other countries, where they can, pay people a lot less, but at the same time, they're continuing to get the service that they were looking for, and so on. And so that's something to keep in mind. Now, focus on this right here, and you guys analyze where this idea right here is missing step 0 or step 1, or it's malaligned, it's not aligned the right way, or is something wrong with it. Just really quickly, finishing this topic up, inshallah, I wanted to discuss, having discussed, where things go wrong and where things go right, the different examples that we went over. So in this case, what is the truth, capital T truth, and that's what we just talked about, right? The idea of what is Islam talking about, and compared to what other people do, for example, right? So, and what is a hypothesis and what is a theory? So how do they connect it together? Capital T truth is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us, right? Or we might sort of have certain rules to establish that for ourselves. So for example, if I look at the ball in the sky, that, the orange ball in the sky, or the yellow ball in the sky, or whatever color it ends up being, so that's that ball in the sky that I see of light. I see that my people around me, for example, my friends, my family members, or whoever, right? My students, whatever, they might see the same thing up in the sky. So when I point towards it, I give it a designation. I call it something. I attach a sound to it. So I say sun, right? And that sound that came out of my mouth, like that you have heard it as the word sun, right? But if somebody else heard it who didn't speak English, it would be just a bunch of sounds to them, right? So that sound is registered in my brain, and then I give it a meaning. I attach that sound to a particular object or a concept or whatever. In this case, I make a noise that sun, that's a noise that I'm making, and I'm attaching it to an object, in this case by pointing to it, right? And so that designation right there is what I've defined as sun, which human beings have defined as the sun. In Arabic, you might call that shams, right? So that designation over there, the word shams is designated to the same end object. So we have different sounds that in different languages for the same end object, right? So that's what I mean over here, where we are designating this. So we can also designate this, and in that case, the truth would be that that is the sun, because everyone is recognizing the same thing. We're saying that that's the sun, the object itself. When we refer to it, we're referring to the object itself, right? So that sun, its light, for example, hits the leaves, and then you have the entire complicated process of photosynthesis, but that process takes place because of that sun's presence over there. So that's the truth, right? That sun being there leads to certain impact. So that sun being there is the truth. That's the capital truth, but we've designated that the name for it or whatever it might be. So that can also be a truth. So it could be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us something, or it could be that we've defined certain things as like how things are, and then when those things happen, then we also call them truths. For example, if a person is Canadian by birth, or they have an identity card because they've gone through the naturalization process or whatever, then in that case, that person would be Canadian, right? Or if you're American by birth, or if you're American by the the naturalization process, for example, then that would be the capital T truth. So after you go through that process and you get that card, all right, or that identification that you are now an American citizen, so that's a capital T truth. So understand that that's the truth. Okay. Now what's a hypothesis? Hypothesis is something. It's an explanation for how things are happening or why things are happening, right? It's just an explanation. You sort of sat down and you said, okay, this is what I think is happening over here. But after you analyze it, and then you can actually measure that. You can actually test that to see if that is actually the capital T truth, like this, right? Or if it's not that. So this is a proposed explanation that can actually be tested. If it can't be tested, it can't be a hypothesis. Okay. Then what is a theory? A theory is, let's say that I have this hypothesis, right, that I end up actually testing. So I test it over and over again. And as I continue testing, it seems that through this repeated experiment, that whatever proposal that I had is actually seeming to be capital T truth, and it's seeming to be fact. So I've tested it, there's evidence, and so on and so on, and it's pointing to the fact, or to that this hypothesis that I have might actually be a truth, or might actually be truth, right? It doesn't necessarily guarantee that I'm gonna hit I'm gonna actually be able to prove this theory as a fact, as a law, like an actual fact, right? As a capital T truth, but it is something that it's the going proposal or the proposed explanation that has yet to be disqualified by any kind of evidence against it. Does that make sense? So the theory of evolution is a theory in the sense that it's not the capital T truth necessarily, as in as we understand it, based on the definition that I mentioned over here. It's not a capital T truth like that. However, it has substance, so it's been substantiated through this repeated experiment. So as of yet, it has not been disqualified or disproven. So as long as it's not disproven, it's going to remain as is, right? So you can continue building the evidence in its favor, and then it's going to have more and more weight because of that. However, it's not necessarily guaranteed to be a capital T truth, because anything could show up that we don't know of yet, right? We haven't gotten an experiment yet that could disqualify it. So as of yet, it's the going thing, and we're going with that. Does that make sense? So if in the future there is an experiment that happens and it disqualifies or disproves this proposed explanation, then this theory is invalidated then, right? So theory is it gains weight through evidence and experiments and so on that seem to indicate that my proposed explanation was correct. But because I don't know, the human experience has not accounted for everything that is possible. So therefore, it could be that any given time in the future, at any given instance, or during any particular experiment, it could be disproven. So the theory of evolution is like that. The body of evidence and that's there, right? So there is a proposed explanation for it. There's a proposed explanation, and the body of evidence has not disproven it yet. Make sense? So that's why it's a continuous, it's a theory. It's called a theory because it hasn't been, it's a proposed explanation, but it is more substantiated because the fact that there is evidence to support the explanation, but that the support over there is not necessarily saying that this is all conclusive. There could be something that shows up in the future that we have not yet uncovered that might say, wait, that's wrong actually, right? So for example, there was this steady state model, for example, before Einstein came up with his new version. There was this idea of how the world came to be, for example, how the universe came to be, or if it was forever a certain way, right? And then as they continued experimenting and they continued discussing and so on, they started realizing, okay, well, maybe this is not the way it's supposed to be, and so they proposed an alternative, right? Because something showed up that sort of disqualified that. Newton's law of gravitation, right? That when he was discussing how gravity works and so on. So on Earth, it seemed to make sense. But now if you're traveling at the speed of light, for example, or other things, then in that case, it didn't really work out as it was thought back then, right? So it needed to be modified. So this is how hypotheses work as well. This, the scientific process is like that. That you have a working, or you have a proposed explanation, you test it out and it seems to be working out. All the experiments seem to be indicating that your explanation was correct. But maybe in the future, you do it in a different setting, for example, or some other, format of doing the testing, and then it might say, wait a minute, it doesn't work in this case though, right? In that case, you have to go back and then readjust your hypothesis or readjust your theory or explanation to account for this anomaly, right? And now when you have the anomaly inserted in it, now you can have an updated version, an updated theory essentially, right? And so the idea of models is whatever that I have, sort of understood, whatever it is that, I'm accounting for in my system or whatever, right? So I can present a model for how things are working. But it could be that I come up with something different later on, and then it might make my model need to have an update. Does that make sense? So and model is, some people use model, like in this case, the author, over here, this article, was mentioning that one of the people suggested, instead of using hypotheses and theories and laws and stuff, right, you can use the word model, because the other words are sort of misunderstood by people. So you can use a model, but model has its own flaws because there's different kinds of models in different settings, different fields within the scientific community, for example, have different understandings of the word model. So how they define model is different in different contexts. So that can also can lead to problems and stuff. But I wanted to make a connection over here. If you remember, we discuss schemas in how like our brains work, for example, how we learn information, and then how it makes how our brain sort of makes systems and like models and stuff about it. So, and I gave you examples. For example, there was a guy holding a gun at a woman's head, right? And I said, what is it that you first think of when you see this? And one of the people mentioned that you think of like, you know, somebody like a bad guy, like trying to kill a person or whatever, right? But then I said, okay, what if I propose that another narrative of this, right? And I said, what if this guy was being bullied by people, and then he picked up one of his oppressors like guns or whatever, and he grabbed one of the aggressors, and he actually pointed the gun at her because she was actually trying to kill him for no reason, or other people that she was, you know, part of, whatever, that they were trying to harm him, and he was just trying to defend himself. So in that case, you know, our schemas are, in this case, would have to be readjusted. Okay, wait a minute. You know, not everyone with a gun necessarily is going to be a bad person, although having a gun doesn't necessarily indicate that you're a good person either, right? So it is a very contextual situation. You have to figure out what the context is to be able to determine. But at the same time, these schemas do help us in terms of reacting to certain situations. For example, we know guns are intended to kill people, right, or to hurt people. And so automatically, if you see a person with a gun and you're afraid, that doesn't mean that you're a bad person for thinking, you know, that for trying to be more protective of yourself, right? That doesn't mean that. So our brains do have our brains have this, you know, way of doing things that can also help us in this case. So that schema is not necessarily a bad thing, but we also have to understand context so we can update the schema in that sense. Okay, so I hope that I understand. Like I hope the idea of updating also makes sense in this case. And then the word skeptic. So the idea is that scientists are supposed to be skeptics. What that means is that remember we talked about discipline, and we said it has to be a very scientific process. So you're trying your best or whatever, you're doing a certain like procedure that you have laid out for yourself. You're trying to reach a certain goal, and so as you're doing this, you realize certain strategies are not working, certain things are working, certain things are not working. So you're constantly evaluating. This is discipline, to constantly evaluate yourself and to assess how you can optimize your path or your steps towards your end goal, right? Towards your end vision. How do you keep adjusting yourself, aligning yourself back so that you can actually go towards the target vision that you have? Right? That's discipline. You constantly optimize yourself. You evaluate yourself. Okay, I tried this didn't work. Let me tweak this and let me try a different way so I can still go towards the same direction, right? If you see, for example, and I mentioned the example of you're driving, and then the newer cars nowadays have this thing where they help you stay in the lane, right? If you sort of, for example, get drowsy and you start going, you know, off the lane, these cars will sort of like force you back in the lane instead, because they have sensors to make sure where the markers are, so they can evaluate where your car is moving, and they can actually turn the car will actually turn this wheel a little bit, the steering wheel, to make sure that you're on the lanes and stuff like that. You're not getting into a different lane, for example, right? So this is the idea of self-correcting machinery. This is how science is supposed to be. Now, not all scientists are going to be like that. And not everyone who claims to be a scientist, let me say it like that, is going to be like that. Because scientists are supposed to keep updating their explanations, or, you know, their ideas or notions and models and stuff like that, based on updates that are coming in from reality. So they do an experiment and it turns out to be a certain way that goes against their model, right? Then they have to adjust their model. They have to adjust their explanation. They have to adjust their theories, for example, right? That's what a skeptic is. So you're never actually sure of what the actual reality is or what you're doing. You're just sort of like thinking that, okay, based on whatever pool of evidence that I have, based on the pool of, you know, data that I have, based on that, I'm sure of what's happening, right? But anything that does not, let me connect to a different word. Interpolation and interpolate or extrapolation, right? When you interpolate versus extrapolate, right? So there's this word of, I don't know if you guys remember this from like data analysis and so on, when you guys were in high school, or middle school even, right? So when you interpolate, you're looking at the data within the, you know, the domain that you have. So for example, if you have x equals 5 until x equals 9, right? So if that's where your data is bounded, because that's all the data that you have, then you're going to interpolate. You can get like x, you know, x is 5.5, x 5.6, and all that stuff, even though you don't have data that's at those points, but you know it's within the domain that you have. So that's interpolation. And then extrapolation is if you go beyond the domain that you have. So like instead of, you know, x equals 5 to x equals 9, if that was your domain, you're going to x equals 500, for example, right? That's going outside of the data that you have, right? So in both cases, whatever the situation is, you're running with the models that you have. And that's why I use a line of best fit example, and I put data points, and then when we're going over that in the first part of this, right? So you constantly evaluate and update based on whatever new information comes. And so the scientific process is a very intensive process where you're not absolutely sure about the capital T truths. You're just constantly learning and learning and learning, because there's infinite possibilities and so many different things that you're looking at, right? You're never actually going to be absolutely certain about anything. So if you're going to talk about, the existence of God, or the existence, or the angels or jinn or whatever and stuff, right? You're not actually going to be able to say with certainty anything. You're going to say, as far as we know, based on the data that we've accumulated through the human experience, right? Meaning in this context of scientific, research and so on, right? Whatever we have, we're not able to confirm or deny essentially this or that. So that's the idea over here. So we're not able to confirm or deny this or that, and that's the issue that we get into when we disconnect from religion, when we disconnect from capital T truth, Islam. When we disconnect from that, that's the kind of issues that we get into. And so that's an important point over here, that science is great in terms of evaluating different theories and things like that. But the problem is that you can't actually be definitive, right? Unless it's in the context of like denying something, or like saying, like, for example, denying something. What I mean by that is saying that, okay, this is green versus this is red, for example, right? Those are some things that you can get into, and you can have some definitive stuff. But it's still, when it comes to, for example, saying Allah does not exist or Allah does exist or whatever, a scientist is never going to be able to, based on just looking at the data, right? The hard evidence data, not deductive reasoning or something like that, but just the hard evidence data is not going to be able to do much. So keep this in mind, because although the scientific process helps, right, but it is not necessarily the way to figuring out capital T truths. And because of that, it's a very experimental situation when you're using that in terms of how you run like the world, for example. So the Black Lives Movement example that we talked about, right, the idea of slavery and so on, that was a very experimental thing, because it was like, let me try this, let me try that, and so on. Okay, this is the last slide that I had. So let me just finish up really quick. The genetics versus epigenetic factors. Genetics is like your DNA, right? But epigenetic factors are those things that can have, that could be chemicals, or it could be food, or it could be the environment, or it could be your thought processes and stuff, right? That trigger certain responses in your genes, for example. Okay, so when it comes to how we are, and one of the contexts that you can look into about this is the concept of sexuality. And I mention this because this is something that's relevant today. A lot of people are sort of misunderstanding this idea. So they're saying that the genetics aspect is what sexuality is based on. But in reality, the studies that have actually happened, they're actually pointing to epigenetic factors. So these are things that are not necessarily connected to, like you're born with this, but it's the influence of your environment, your chemicals, other exposures that you have and stuff, right, that impact how you're going to be in terms of navigating different contexts, or your sexuality or whatever and stuff, right? So that people sort of disconnect, or they misunderstand this. So they sort of align. They think the capital T truth is that in the genetics, whereas the actual capital T truth is in the epigenetic factors. So with that, and I know I kind of rushed through this, but anyways, the idea was pretty much, how is it that we connect? What is the connection to step 0 and 1? Well, remember that truths come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can also designate certain things, but there's a limited scope to that. And then you need to understand the difference between hypothesis and theory, because a lot of times we're running on theories or hypotheses, not actually capital T truths, right? And so this is where we go off track when it comes to step 0 and 1. So with that, your homework is just to kind of with this, what we've just talked about hypotheses, about how truths work, about how models and frameworks and stuff, all that works, right? So understand how it impacts society as a whole, how it impacts you as a person, how it impacts your different environments and relationships that you're in. So that's it. With that, I'm going to conclude, inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakumullah khairan.